Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of diplomacy between the wars, and in this series of lectures we'll focus on diplomacy in the 1930s. In this initial lecture, we're going to talk about the diplomacy of the early 1930s, when the policies of the 20s were put to the test. We'll talk about, in particular, the good neighbor policy of the FDR administration. By the early 1930s, most European nations, including Great Britain, France, Russia, and of course Germany, embarked on programs rebuilding and expanding their militaries, as the United States did as well. But we're still nearly a decade away from the beginnings of World War II and more than a decade away from United States involvement in the war. So in the early 30s, the United States still had little to fear, it seemed, from aggressive action from Europe. And so one of the early issues that the United States faced in the 30s came not from Europe at all, but from Asia. The scholar Warren Cohen, in his book Empire Without Tears, argued that in the 1920s, the will to maintain peace was enough. Promises and pacts served their purpose. But by the 1930s, will was no longer enough. To maintain peace, you had to be willing to use force. As Cohen suggests, the 1930s put the kissing diplomacy of the 20s to the test. It started early, in 1931, at a familiar site, Manchuria. Japan, like much of the world, was suffering from a poor economy in the early 1930s, and spurred on by a group of young, hyper-patriotic soldiers, they looked to expand into China, and particularly the district of Manchuria. In their view, more land meant more people, more products, and more markets to aid in their battle against the Depression. So Japan invaded Manchuria. And the question became, what would the rest of the world do about it? By invading Manchuria, Japan had broken the Nine-Power Treaty that promised to preserve the open door in China, and they had broken the Kellogg-Briand Pact that promised not to go to war. In response, the U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, issued what has come to be known as the Stimson Doctrine. It said that the United States refused to recognize the Japanese government after their show of force in China. Now, this idea of non-recognition had a long history in American diplomacy. And it's not nothing. Many other nations around the world, particularly smaller nations, rely on maintaining good relations with the United States, and not being recognized meant essentially no trade, no negotiations, no treaties, no protection. But in this case, Japan reckoned that whatever cost might come with not being recognized by the United States was worth it in their quest to expand, and particularly their conquest of Manchuria. So non-recognition simply wasn't good enough. So the problems of those 1920s peace treaties begin to become apparent. There's no real mechanism for enforcing them. Remember the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the so-called kissing diplomacy of the 20s, that so many nations joined saying they wouldn't go to war unless they went to war. Well, Japan goes to war, and the test becomes who's going to do anything about it. The other option might have been the League of Nations, and they did respond to Japan's attack as well, in similar fashion to the United States, by not recognizing Japan. Japan's response was to withdraw from the League of Nations. And so again, we see this organization that really doesn't have any teeth. Historians have generally given low marks to Stimson and others in their weak response to Japan. Recently, though, some scholars have defended the responses of the Hoover administration. As Christopher Thorne writes, there was little that the United States, Britain, and France, singly or even together, could do to make the Japanese surrender over Manchuria, without accepting a high risk of extensive costs. So by the early 1930s, the kissing diplomacy of the 20s is beginning to unravel, As William Cohen suggests, the will to maintain peace was no longer going to be good enough. It was going to require force. By 1933, the state of affairs in the world is beginning to change, and particularly in two nations of note, the United States and Germany. And in both of those nations, new leaders took the stage, whose careers would overshadow the next 12 to 13 years of global affairs. In the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took over as president, and in Germany, Adolf Hitler rose to power. The anxious peace of the 1920s will soon give way to all-out war by the late 1930s. In 1933, FDR took office as president. Everyone remembers from his inaugural address the famous phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And with good reason, FDR was rightly concerned with domestic affairs and battling against the Great Depression. And that is where he focused his attention. But also in that inaugural address, often overlooked, was one short paragraph about his foreign policy. In it, he said he would dedicate the nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself, and because he does so, respects the rights of others. This laid the foundation for what would become known as the good neighbor policy, which was one of the anchors of FDR's foreign relations in the early part of his administration. The good neighbor policy primarily applied to Latin America. They are, of course, among our closest neighbors. The central idea of it was that the United States would withdraw all forces from Latin America and henceforth would not intervene in their affairs. Part of what inspired the policy was that after World War I, European nations were weakened and not as inclined to be involved in affairs in Latin America. So there wasn't too much competition from the rest of the world, and the United States could more or less act as they saw fit. By the mid-1930s, though, we'll see nations like Germany, England, and even Japan begin to recover enough to compete for markets in the Americas. So the United States needed to behave itself better to keep its trading partners in the Americas. The good neighbor policy in 1933 to 35 or so saw the United States withdraw from a number of countries, including Cuba and Haiti. Other affairs were beginning to come to a head. By the late 1930s, the good neighbor policy would be tested. Part of that test came as a result of German involvement in Latin America. Again, one of the reasons the United States was able to practice non-intervention was because competition from other countries was limited. But by the mid-1930s, Germany, under Adolf Hitler, was beginning to recover economically and beginning to look abroad once again. In 1935, Germany announced the New Plan, in which it expanded trade with Latin American countries by offering credit and favorable bartering. They gained much trade in Latin America in 1935 and 36, and had become a worthy opponent to the United States for trade in some nations. Coinciding with this rise in foreign competition came the greatest single test to the good neighbor policy. In Mexico, in 1936, a new president came to power, Lázaro Cárdenas. Cárdenas was a hero in Mexico. He reformed the land, taking large landed estates away from the plantation owners and the churches and giving it to the masses. He started building many public schools in the countryside, and the masses in Mexico loved him. But his greatest claim to fame in Mexico and infamy in America came in March of 1938, when Cárdenas expropriated foreign-owned oil properties. What did that mean? Well, essentially he kicked out American oil companies and took them for the Mexican government. Ostensibly he did it because these companies had refused to pay taxes as per a court order in Mexico. And so the good neighbor policy was put to a serious test. How would the United States respond? Obviously, the American oil companies were furious. The United States, as a nation, is used to imposing its needs on lesser nations, not to being pushed around by a country like Mexico. The United States did try to respond in a few ways. Initially, they boycotted Mexican oil. But the Mexicans were very successful at finding other markets, partly due to an American named William Rhodes Davis, a shipping entrepreneur, who assisted the Mexicans in getting their oil to other buyers. They also attempted, the Americans, to boycott Mexican silver, and they did this to a mild degree, but FDR understood that the Mexicans would be able to find other markets for their silver as well. Roosevelt said, if we stopped buying Mexican silver, they would sell it to somebody else. If we boycotted oil, the president of Mexico would, I'm inclined to think, sell more oil to Italy and Germany to make up for the amount. There isn't very much more you could do. So the United States was in a tough spot. Germany was a popular trading partner, and the United States was in danger of losing much of the market to Germany. So they backed down. It wasn't until 1941 that the two came to an agreement. According to that agreement, Mexico would pay American oil companies $40 million for the property they had expropriated, and American trade with Mexico would resume as normal. Finally, American builders would loan Mexico $30 million to finish building a Mexican highway. So that's essentially how the good neighbor policy worked out. No intervention. We didn't send in troops to straighten things out. And truly it was a more self-deterministic atmosphere for Mexico and the other nations in question. We were, in some ways, behaving as a better neighbor than in the past. At the same time, American domination, control, and financial interest were not as complete as they had been previously. As a final note on the good neighbor policy, it extended in some ways to Russia as well, even though we're not necessarily as close geographically as we are to some of the Latin American nations. But the spirit extended across the Pacific to Russia. This came in the form of FDR's decision in 1933 to finally recognize the new government of Russia. Recall that during the Russian Revolution, the United States had refused to recognize their government. In the United States, fear of spreading communism had led to the Red Scare and paranoia regarding communists. By the early 1930s, though, this paranoia had long since faded and was replaced by the Great Depression and the need and desire to find new markets. Russia loomed as a great potential untapped market, much as China had for many years. So in 1933, after becoming president, FDR extended an olive branch and encouraged meetings with Russian representatives. On November 16, 1933, the two nations exchanged formal notes that effectively amounted to American recognition of Russia and renewed relations. In the notes, the Soviet commissar promised that his country would abstain from propaganda in the United States and extend religious freedom to Americans in the Soviet Union. Even though relations between the two nations were restored, affairs between them were still rocky. They bickered endlessly over many issues in the 30s, among them the status of war debts left over from World War I, and by the mid-1930s relations had begun to cool once again. The United States was always suspicious and careful when dealing with the Russians. And as we'll see in the next series of lectures, affairs with Russia led in part to the series of neutrality acts in the mid-1930s.